Recording. And what is up, everybody? Our long hiatus has come to a close, and we are once again back with you all. I am Free Beer Tomorrow, joined by the big Signorelli. We're all out of puns, at least I am. Maybe he's got one in the chamber. I don't know.
Chamber pot that Freud pissed in, and apparently this dream.
Yep,
to
Freud
inject
was a
you.
pisser.
We're about to inject you with some knowledge right now.
That's right. Foremost among these bits of knowledge we have for you is Freud pissed in a chamber pot as a young man.
The 36 chamber pots.
But who didn't back then? Because
Yeah.
back then it was like people had outhouses, right?
Right.
You
Yeah.
wouldn't have had indoor plumbing. Did they have indoor plumbing during the Victorian era?
I don't think so, and if they did, it was probably very bad.
I would imagine so. I just picture everyone was like either a chimney sweep back then or, a guy in a horse-drawn carriage who was like spitting on
Right.
chimney sweeps.
I remember like in the early like industrial period, like people were dumping their chamber pots like all out like in the street, so like it just
Yeah.
reeked. Yeah. That's gross.
London must have been really gross back then. I mean,
Yeah.
not that Freud was in London, but I'm sure Vienna wasn't all that better.
Well, no, it wasn't he in London like before he died?
Was he?
Yeah, that's why
Yeah, I
there's
think
like
so.
the
He was,
famous museum over there and like his famous like office and couch and everything like that.
we all need to watch Century of the Self, by the way. It begins with Freud in his later days. It's the story of, it's a documentary about the rise of advertising and how
Oh, and his
Edward Bernays,
which is like his grandson or his
his
nephew or something.
grandson, basically, in a very crude way, applied his concepts to advertising. And
Right.
the kind of advertising we have today is a direct result of Bernays' influence. So
Hmm.
it's really interesting. But at the beginning of the documentary focuses on like the end of Freud's life and his total jadedness in a way, like his loss of faith in humanity.
Right. And then apparently like even like Edward Bernays, like when he went to America, like apparently there was like a lot of bastardization of Floyd and he like wrote a letter saying like grandpa, they're like, misrepresenting your name. You must say something.
Right.
And like he kind of replied back saying like he really just doesn't care.
No, our friend, I think his name's Owen, who we met at the Lacan conference. He told us this story.
Right. Yeah.
Uncle Freud, Uncle Siggy. Uh, how have we not even
Yeah.
realized that one? There's the pun right there. Big
Yeah.
Sigmund. But he responded to Bernays after Bernays basically was in a tizzy about his name being besmirched with just two words. Never mind.
Yeah.
Didn't give a shit. I don't think he had much
Yeah.
regard for Americans
Yeah.
in general. Can you blame him? Now we love the USA. God bless the USA.
It's funny like how like even in like psychology and like in America how everybody's so dismissive of Freud, but yet just like at the end of the day it's like, oh, Freud would have had a field day with
Yeah,
this.
we were just talking about that. It's like whenever you hear some terrible story about, I don't know, someone keeping people locked in a basement and playing out weird Oedipal scenarios. It's like, oh, Freud would have had a field day. It's like, yeah, he was just constantly horny for like the most
Yeah.
out there scenarios and like family dynamics. I'm sure like a lot of what he dealt with was like really banal, and like not all that juicy.
Right.
Talking to
But
people.
we do get into like a little snippet of that in this chapter with his sort of like I guess a failure or just having to sort of abandon and jettison the seduction theory because of the amount of criticisms and controversy it was getting.
Right.
Yeah. which for those of you who don't know, like this is during the time where Freud was really like starting to immerse within not only the dream theory, like in the early 19th centuries, it's like 1890 something. In 1897 is where he not only has the dream of Irma's injection, but also having to kind of come uh, to a sort of conclusion of jettisoning this notion of um, the seduction theory. But simultaneously, he's working with patients doing, free association, doing psychoanalysis. He had, switched from doing hypnotic therapy to strictly, psychoanalytic theory, as we would see today, in a sort of like embryonic stages and, investigating dreams. But the sort of seduction theory has to deal with the fact that prior to the age of 8 and even like so between the age of 8 and I think it's like 12 where like children start to go through puberty and stuff like that, there are like encounters of sexual abuse amongst them and their guardian or family member, which was very controversial because it's talking about how pretty much like this is sort of like not only a deviation to like the natural course of like I guess libido, but also like how it affects and it kind of produces like repression in the unconscious. But I know like somebody like Laplanche and Pontelli's kind of like revitalize it and kind of give a new twist on it to talk about how like it is sort of like this inverted message that kind of creates the other's discourse within the child using kind of like a Lacanian twist on it, like the symbolic order, right? And kind of trauma being because if you look at like let's say like we look at like the Wolfman's issue with seeing the parents at Turgo, right? It's something that was like uh, you could say like during like his early development that as he was in the symbolic order, as he was developing language, it's like something that like resisted symbolization and didn't kind of come into his entire network of signifiers as he was gaining admission through language, right? It's that excess that was taken out, and we could see that in the seduction theory of sort of like sexual abuse and all these other things that can only be accounted for retroactively.
Did you know that Snoop Dogg's first album was actually originally titled Coitus Atergo?
Turgo?
Yeah.
Yeah. You see Wolfman in the background.
It's a wolfy wolf world. Sorry, that was just a way of bulldozing everything you've been saying there. No, that was very interesting. And right now, like I feel like we are at a very important juncture in the development of Lacan's thought, because the dream of Irma's injection is where it all sort of comes to a head, everything he's been talking about so
You
far.
almost said rejection.
I did almost say rejection, right?
Right. And but where Lacan is like rejecting regression, because you see like in here, which is an important thing to realize, is that the notion of regression and even the fulfillment wish, unfulfilled wish, is very sort of contradicted in the dream of the dream, which we'll kind of discuss, and how Lacan applies the three registers. And it's like, we have no use for the term regression because Freud was so limited with his topographical models of like the psychical apparatus.
Right, so he's like kind of trying to get beyond these
Yeah,
schemata,
limitations.
basically.
Yeah.
And
And he's
would you say that in a sense he is presenting these schemata as a prelude to what he considers a much better schema or model, which is that of the Baromean knot, the three registers? Because he
right.
often says if Freud had a concept of the imaginary, which is already latent in his system, then this would have been explained more expediently in a sense.
Exactly, because he doesn't have a notion of the imaginary like a la Lacan, but at the same time, like one limitation with this sort of schematas that Freud is working with is that he puts so much like emphasis on perception consciousness, right? In the sort of waking state, in which for Lacan and the imaginary, the perception is sort of a small sort of juncture or focal point within the imaginary register, which sort of tries to create, I guess, a structure, but really the imaginary is the structure that allows for perception to sort of gain a whole picture. But perception itself is like fleeting to Lacan, it seems like. Well, the imaginary itself on its own and sort of mirroring is fleeting, because this is why he says that the symbolic is important and why the name kind of holds the object in place, right?
The
As he
name
says,
the name is
the time of the thing, right?
or the concept is the time of the thing. And I guess
Yeah.
he extends it to, yeah, include nomination, as he puts it. And it's a callback to what he says at the end of Seminar 1, but now we can see it in a clearer light because we're relating it directly to repression. Desire makes its not first appearance, but I think it's first like really major appearance in this chapter. And of course, what's really fascinating about this entire discussion, exploration of Freud's dream is that it's like there's so many meta levels to it, because we're witnessing Freud discover the unconscious here, in a sense, his concept of the unconscious, because he has this
Yes.
dream around the same time that he discovers the unconscious. And it's as if he's forced to make this discovery because he's always, chafing against the limitations of his theories and techniques as they stand at a particular moment in his development, but also trying to surpass them. But here we have the dream as sort of like the emblematic, let's say, encapsulation of everything psychoanalysis is all about, because but through interpreting the dream, we can interpret, we can locate the royal road to the unconscious, right?
Right.
Is in the dream. It's in the structure of the dream. And this dream in particular is like a dream of a dream. It is the exemplar dream.
Yeah, and
Exemplary dream.
even like Brian Becker in his episode says that it's like almost like the way we interpret Lacan interprets this for everybody. It's like a meta dream for Freud, but like it's not like a sort of like creating a meta language. No, it's what it is like putting like a sort of grounds for future dream interpretation, like a sort of prolegomena to any future dream.
I like that.
Yeah,
That's sick.
yeah,
That's the name of your mixtape right there.
yeah.
Like a minute, any future dream. It's like here we have a lot going on, because we have the manifest content and the latent content of the dream. I don't feel confident that I can describe it in perfect detail, but he's basically at a dinner party. He sees one of his patients. For those of you who think that it's a good idea to be friends with your patient, we had one commenter in the Stutz video saying like, what's wrong with Stutz and Jonah Hill being best friends? Well, nothing. For that kind of therapy, there's nothing wrong with it, but we'll find at one point during this chapter that he says very flat out it is to be avoided being
Right.
friends with your patients, and even being in the same place as them if you can avoid it, right? Like
Exactly.
outside of therapy.
Because
But
this
I'm
is like the
going
first
all over the
instance.
place here. Yeah.
No, you're on the right track, because right here he even says this is like in the dream. Like there's multiple things in the dream that which we'll get to in a bit, but like Freud is dealing with countertransference in the dream, and this is things that many analysts can sort of attest for who deal with a lot of patients, and some that are very, I guess for lack of a better term, not to sort of put patients like sort of beneath people or therapists, but can be very fragile, and sometimes they can be worrisome for the analysts themselves because they're of like high risk, right? Physical health or like mentally, especially like risk of suicide. So that does create a lot of anxiety, both as symbolically, it's like, oh shit, if I don't help this patient out, like I may lose my license type thing, and just like being rejected by society for being like a monster, for being like, a terrible doctor or whatever like that, or just the whole human guilt of just not being able to do your best and fulfill your own sort of human obligation or whatever.
And guilt is a theme we're dealing with also with
Exactly,
this
exactly.
dream, because Freud, in trying to evolve his technique, is also trying to understand what the object of this technique is and who he is as a practitioner of it, because it's like something he's inventing. So it's a very difficult position to be in. And in this dream, seeing his patient at this dinner party, well, it arouses different affects. But what else can we say about the dream itself, just the manifest content?
Right. So like right here, as far as the content goes, which again, like right before we want to start explaining about the dream, there's also two different interpretations we're dealing with besides the meta interpretation of Lacan. So we have Freud's own interpretation of the dream, and then we got that of Eric Erikson, a
Right.
famous therapist. I don't even know like what school of thinking
He
or
was an analyst, though, I'm
he
pretty
was an
sure. Yeah.
analyst though. But to like where we could like locate him though, probably like something along the lines of like relational, interpersonal type things. Definitely not on the like object relations or even Freudian, but he has a thing called sort of culturalism, in which
Yes.
he's kind of trying to analyze the sort of cultural elements that kind of have a direct effect on Freud's ego. And I should emphasize on its ego because we'll get into that more with the problem of regression, um, and developmentalism, whether on a genetic topographical model, which Freud advocates, versus the sort of cultural context. It's like, oh, it's just because Freud was Jewish or because Freud, pissed in a chamber pot type thing, which I think he sort
Or
of,
had a Catholic nanny in
yeah,
this case, right?
yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah,
supposed to
yeah,
be very
exactly.
a decisive influence. But the thing that's interesting about it's like these aspects shouldn't be completely disregarded. I mean, we should keep in mind the world within which he's moving and thinking and the kind of people he's coming into contact with, and the events of his life are not irrelevant at all.
Right.
The issue is that this kind of culturism that Lacan is not dismissing, but trying to get us away from as a lens is similar to historicizing, I would say.
Exactly.
What
Exactly.
Zizek also denounces often, which is historicizing all social phenomena.
Mhm.
The symbolic cannot be properly historicized because we are within it, and our own vantage point is often obfuscated when we are historicizing. I
Right.
want to say one
Exactly.
more thing about, like, it reminds me of what happened people, a general approach to literary critique, which would take into account all of the historical and but also um, biographical factors of the author's life that somehow determine the content itself.
Right.
And it's like the issue with that is that there's also often a layer of very vulgar analysis going on, and that it like that's what many literary critics do when they try to ascribe certain motives to a character or motives to the author themselves, in that it's like, oh, okay, I can pick out the rational, like make come to the surface, this rational grid that we're applying over the content itself, so that the message of a book or movie emerges with it. And what Lacan is promoting here as an approach is that we see the dream not as a text absolutely to be read, but not a text to get outside of. We want to see the form of the text, but we're not looking for the ultimate message of like, love your fellow man, or don't litter. It's it's the form itself, which doesn't mean anything in a sense. It's just the structure.
Yeah, because like if anything, if there are some like sort of fissures or deadlocks within the text, it's something that is missed by the writer, and it has nothing to do with the sort of like, oh, it's just because they were a white cis male that grew up in a Jewish family and they, had a lot of money during the Victorian time. They came from wealth and they're educated. It's like, no, that's all there in the sort of ego, and whether you want to call it the symbolic coordinates of like the ego ideal, for a matter of fact, but it has nothing to do with sort of unconscious, which is more structural. And this is why like the symbolic order has nothing to do with culture in and of itself, but rather, you can see culture as sort of an imaginary aspect, which does need sort of symbolic situation, but it's not the sort of meta thing of it. And one thing I want to point out about this is like even Lacan had a patient who I think he's had many patients that were Islamic, and he mentions one about like I think it's like the fear of getting their hand cut off because the law says if like you steal, or I think even something with masturbation that you get your hand cut off. And he's not saying that this person's neurosis is because they're Islamic. Rather, the adherence to this is sort of a misrecognition of the law, right? Of the signifier, I think, is what Lacan is getting at.
Right, because if you think about the narcissistic structuration of man's perception of themselves and the world, there have to be these points where there's like almost a kind of atrophying of the symbolic, where the translation, if you want to call it that, isn't as smooth as when the imaginary relations that we live with and live by are operative and like create a kind of smooth one-to-one correspondence of like signifier and signified. It's these symptoms manifest themselves in a bodily way because there's kind of, I think something like this Islamic law of a thief getting their hand cut off for stealing, it is metaphorized in the pain that this man feels in his hand. And it's not enough to say, oh, he grew up in an Islamic household and that's why he thinks that. What was interesting to Lacan about that example was the fact that consciously this man had renounced Islam. He had no sympathies with the religion of his father, but the idea is that it was still it's a kind of truth that's concentrated in a different way. It isn't like, let's say, discharged in just everyday conscious reality. And that's one of the things that we're going to talk about here is like, and this is what I wanted to get at with the idea of textual criticism, in a sense that by ascribing motives to characters and everything, as Lacan's going to say, we imagine that the subject has a instrumental role in truth production, which the subject does not. That's the fascinating thing, is that we are not part of this truth production. When we think, I did this because I wanted this to happen, we always talk about our lives in this way, the choices we make and everything, as if the truth of our lives is up to us.
Yeah.
Lacan's basically going to say, not exactly.
Yeah.
And I know we don't want to go over
Yeah.
2 hours. I
So we
do.
pretty much, yeah, we should start getting into like the
Let's get
pointers.
past the culturism stuff. I hate summarizing the details of, like a dream or a case, because I always get them wrong. But
We could read the dream.
you already know. So it says here, that he sees Irma. She approaches him, saying she has these pains in her throat, stomach, and abdomen. Freud checks her out, which is interesting because it reminds us that Freud is a physician of sorts.
Right.
He was able to diagnose also physical illnesses. So he investigates her, and then there is this famous scene, very cinematic, where her mouth opens properly,
Right.
large white spot.
There's
Sees
something that you should point
structures.
out
Yep.
though. I don't mean to cut you
No, no,
off,
go
but
for it. Cut
there's
cut me off.
something
Cut me
right
off.
here though that is important because Lacan is gonna make this like funny little like humorous like logic. But when he's checking her out, when she's addressing the pains, he addresses like a solution to her, and she wants to reject it, and then he says that if you still have pains, it is really only your fault.
Mm.
And this is important because, as Lacan will point out, that sort of something that I guess made Freud money back in the day and his sort of diagnosis for neurotics is that they're very bad boys or very bad girls. So they do the good thing and good things will happen. If you do the bad things, well, that's why you feel guilty and that's why you're suffering.
Exactly.
Yeah.
As if
It is a conscious choice, right?
it kind of goes back to the message to be distilled from the text of what one should do, guide me.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And then we have Freud's good friend Otto. I can't help but picture Otto from The Simpsons. It's even funnier, just like the idea that Otto is giving
the bus driver.
the bus driver. Hey man, give her injection of preparation of propionic acid, trimethylamine.
Right. Wasn't he like the sort of druggy psychedelic dude?
Yeah, there's an episode where his girlfriend's like, he doesn't even do any needle drugs. So, whoa, man, the syringe probably wasn't clean.
That's good. That's a meme right there.
So that like syringe line is sort of also an allusion to his the instrument he wields as a analysis an
Right.
analyst, in the sense of like he doesn't know exactly what he's doing, and there are consequences beyond what he can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
What do we want to focus on at this point?
So right there, I think that's important because we could quilt it in
Yeah.
with the whole point of countertransference.
Go for it.
And as we addressed, she was she being Irma was a family friend of Freud's. So again, being a close acquaintance also added to the guilt, but also the syringe being clean. I like how you pointed that out. It's like this sort of, I'm afraid, I have this fear and anxiety that I don't know what I'm doing, which is funny because it's like in seminar 10, Lacan situates not only anxiety like on the patient, but also the anxiety is sort of exacerbated. And I think there's a technical, I guess like a practical aspect in technique for the analyst to sort of use their own anxiety as a power to be like, to make them recognize that they aren't the masters, right? Because, they're not going to be like a Stutz bro saying, sit down, shut up, and listen to what I'm saying. And, I'll fix you and you'll be better, right? To evoke the master's discourse is to kind of get away from the enigmatic desire that the analyst brings by situating themselves as objet. So that's just kind of like a side note, which I think is pretty interesting right here, even though Freud is like feeling this anxiety. It's like, even then, like this fear of not knowing what he's doing. comes out in the dream, but also becomes the dream of the dreams, which helps sort of uh, propel the technique of analysis forward, which I think is pretty
Right,
fascinating.
because what Lacan points out here is that the dream is almost unconsciously produced for the psychoanalytic community.
Right.
Say, here, this is a dream. Take a look at the form of the dream. What's interesting, though, is that he also points out how this dream, as opposed to maybe other dreams that of other people or himself that Freud had analyzed, is more so preconscious. It's
Right.
not the perfect exemplification of the way the unconscious might structure a dream. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think because what we're talking about here with the latent content of Freud's anxiety over his, let's, for lack of a better term, imposter syndrome,
Right.
it's like that's easy enough to discern in the
Right. Right.
details, whereas like the unconscious, on the other hand, has to do with the formal aspects of the dream, which don't mean anything in and of themselves, almost point only to themselves, if that makes sense. I don't know.
Yeah. And this shows like how there is a sort of antinomy with the notion of like the pre everything that's sort of preconscious and um the sort of wish fulfillment process within the dream. How it's almost like there is nothing wish fulfilling in this dream for Freud on the sort of latent content and even with his understanding of the psychic apparatus prior to the discovery of what would be like the unconscious par excellence that decenters the ego, right? And it's interesting too because apparently, like the interpretation that was initially Freud's was like, oh, it was a fulfillment of the wish by like relieving guilt and also having a revenge fantasy on Otto, right? Which is like, okay, if you take the sort of topographical notion of regression of, oh, needing to go, this energy and excitation needing to go somewhere because it doesn't move forward, well, let's move backwards into the dream and fulfill itself. Done, right? But when we take the three registers, right, and the real, right, like it's different when desire, and not only that, but the drive, which is located in the real, especially when we're talking about death drive in the seminar, constantly repeats in the dream. The form of the dream happens in different repetitions, right? Especially in the case of like Fort Da, which of course is not a dream, it's a fantasy, but we see how the relation between dream and fantasy and these two registers kind of intertwine, right? It's one thing to just have this like uh prior notion of the unconscious and be like, all right, I had this dream and then my wish was fulfilled um in the sleeping life, not the waking life. Now I can move on and continue the pleasure principle, right? But no, right? The pleasure principle is never attained. And so this is like the whole problem of not only regression, but also the later discovery of the death instinct in Freud and how Lacan kind of brings this on. Does that make sense?
Sort of. There was a lot there. I'm trying to. Did you say
Because
repression or regression?
regression,
Regression, yeah.
yeah, because it has to align with the sort of model of like, oh, if you, the pleasure principle will attain itself in some way, right? But it doesn't, especially like because he doesn't really talk about, from my understanding, nightmares all that much in the interpretation of dreams, but like nightmares, trauma, stuff like that. That's not like fulfillment of the pleasure principle. That's like
Right, right.
the manifestation of like the death drive, and it's a constant repetition where no pleasure is fulfilled or
Yeah.
or no wish fulfillment, right? And
Because
this
if
is
you,
like
yeah. Sorry, go
yeah,
ahead.
this is like the his previous notion of wish fulfillment or like what Lacan would call desire, right? And something else, which is drive, because drive is repetitive and it enjoys. It's like the whole notion of the difference between pleasure and jouissance, right? jouissance is this insatiable excitation that just keeps coming and back and wanting more, and it's excess.
Right. And what's interesting about the dream is that it would appear to be the facilitator of the pleasure principle in as much as it keeps one
Yeah.
sleeping,
And
right?
then yeah.
It
And
doesn't always.
exactly, yeah.
It's like the dream is also interrupting sleep
Right.
if it's a oftentimes if it's a nightmare.
Yeah, and Freud was also onto this. That's why there's a lot of antinomies and contradictions in this because of the forgetting of dreams too. Then where does regression lie in that? I mean, I think we talked about it in a couple chapters ago in this one, but still, like, I think that also poses a problem too because, like, with his whole schemata, if regression trying to attain pleasure, doesn't get into the waking life, but then we also have forgetting of dreams. Um, how, was there how does pleasure get sort of satisfied in that regards, which I mean, look, I think Lacan is pointing out. The last thing I want to add too is the whole notion of the ego and the importance of like the unconscious and dissenting, because with latent content, right, Lacan points this out. It's like we shouldn't dismiss the ego in the dream. We should locate it where it's at and how it takes on multiple forms, because we're not talking about a homologous, unified uh, egg or like sensor. We're talking about like an empty egg, and how the ego is always in a series of identifications with this mirror stage or optical schema thing, and how we can see sort of a series of identifications of Freud onto not only Irma, but also like Otto and Dr. or what is it? Is it Mr. M or Dr. M? And I think there's one more other person in the dream. But these are different aspects of Freud's sort of identifications.
Right.
Then what
Right.
Lacan says is like he calls it was it polycephal, like multiple heads, right? More than polycephalic.
Yeah.
Um, and the point is like to find the sign that is acephalic, right? Without an image. So we see the ego as polycephalic, as constantly needing multiple aspects or images of itself. This is the whole point of the imaginary, always going through a series of identifications because it's always fleeting. But what kind of maintains that and mediates that is the sort of symbolic identification. But there are some parts of the dream where the sign, right, the word is without an image, and there's where we locate the real.
That's funny. If we take it to lack and desire, the polycephalic, cephalic, I don't
I
know.
guess cephalic,
Now we have
cephalic,
like
yeah.
the phallus is, worming its way in there.
Polycephalus.
The many phalluses, which I'm sure Lacan would not shy away from that interpretation of that wordplay there. But with the many-headed versus the headless is what these two terms mean, acephalic and polycephalic. It reminds me of sort of the multiplicity that comes to fill in the gap or emptiness of lack in a sense.
Mhm.
So there we have desire because it's the more identifications we upturn in our quest to interpret the dream, the more we come across the void of
Yeah.
desire that is trying to be almost covered over by these many-headed
Yeah.
identifications, because it's like, okay, because the other thing is it's not just like, oh well, once we clear away all of these identifications then we can get to the void. It's also that who is the subject producing
Right.
these images,
Exactly.
and the dreamer, the subject of the dreamer is not you in the sense of like the you that you perceive in waking life as yourself when you say, I did that, I decided to eat this for lunch, I went here, I spent my day this way. Everything is kind of sealed shut. But
Exactly.
in the dream, who's producing these images? Where are these symbols
Yes.
coming from?
Because again, with the origins of the optical schema comes from the sort of schemata of the mnemic sort of schema that Freud has in the interpretation of dreams. So it's like who is the subject producing the dreams could be the same as like who is the abstract I in the optical schema, because we're not just the abstract I, right? But like who's producing all these images for identifications in that, which is also sort of trying to create like a narcissistic relation. So we see these sort of identifications not only in Freud looking at, you know, Irma and inspecting her throat, but then also like Otto intervening, and then these other people. These are different sort of narcissistic relations that seem to happen in Freud's sort of taking himself into account. But it's like, well, who's the subject of Freud? And not only that, but who's the subject of the dreamer, right? The dream.
Well, so here's my question for you then. How are these narcissistic relations manifested differently in the dream versus in reality?
Well, I would say it's like there's pretty much there isn't really a difference. It's pretty much kind of the same, though. I think, well, I shouldn't say there is a difference, but the main difference is that sort of the subject is trying to take itself into account in the dream in certain ways that it's hard to recognize in
Right.
daily life because of the mediation of language. Of course, we're
That's
still
sick.
dealing with early Lacan, so he'll talk about empty speech versus the full speech, right? But here's something that I want to evoke, because you just made your recent video essay on the cogito and the I as other. This is an example of the I is an other in the dream,
Right.
because it's not a homologous Freud, it's not the Freud of culture and of a culturalism of like, oh, it's his Jewishness or his scientific discoveries. Of course, there is some of that aspect in there, because like, of course, this dream is also a major scientific discovery for him. So like Freud is the creator of psychoanalysis. But right here, we're getting a sort of like Freud trying to sort of, maybe for lack of a better term, logical time, take himself into an account and anticipate himself within other subjects.
Right, because he says that when he has a dream of the Spanish Civil War or something, like there's a Freud in the dream, but he says, you might think I'm that Freud. I'm the commandant who died,
Right.
which is
Yeah.
crazy because it's like you could represent yourself in the dream, someone who looks like you. Have you ever looked
Right.
in a mirror in the dream and it's like it's never quite you, but like it doesn't matter if there's still someone named Andrew in the dream. Andrew could be elsewhere. Like one identification
Right.
could be more pregnant than another in a
So
sense.
so and I think like, for Jung, he would call that like the sort of shadow. But then like for Freud or like Lacan, it's like that sort of lost image that disappears within the sort of primary and secondary narcissism. And you could see it's like, when we have dreams, right, we're always saying like, yeah, I was flying, or I was falling, or like I was doing this. Like when you see an image of yourself in your body, you could see that, at least in my interpretation, that would be like the sort of like primary narcissism of like the fragmented body of which you identify with. And it does have productive reasons for it being a misrecognition, right? It allows for the sort of motor skills, motor functions, being able to, have coordination for your body, but
Right.
it's still a
Yeah, because
misrecognition.
we should say like when we talk about narcissistic, we don't mean in the everyday like NPD sense of like
Oh yeah, like a
of,
personality disorder
of
where
just
it's
like
just like,
someone who's,
oh,
completely non-empathetic and
and a
out
manipulator,
for themselves.
sociopath.
Yeah, we mean narcissistic in the sense of
It's an
or
identification.
nuanced. Yeah, it's in terms all identifications are narcissistic in the sense of if you think about the narcissist myth, he is obsessed with his own image. He's in love with his own image. Nothing's more beautiful than his own image. He's transfixed, and it's not the story of a character who's selfish. It's not the story of a character that mistreats people based like that's another kind of narcissism. Um, let's see. So, all right, we're making good time here. The famous, well, actually, there are two things that we should probably talk about. One, I think, because I know Slavoj often refers to this joke about the kettle.
Right. I love
Oh,
that.
we have
This is
like it's a great joke. There's like, and it has to do with the logic of a dream in many ways. But what's the joke? Okay,
it's
you tell it.
you're
You're better at telling
yeah,
me.
so it's like you're borrowing a kettle from a friend, and it has a hole in it. So the first part of the joke is that you know I returned the kettle intact, and but the second thing is that even though it had a hole with it, even though like I returned it with a hole in it, it already had a hole before I even borrowed it. And the third thing is that I didn't even borrow it.
Right. So we have like three mutually exclusive
Right.
propositions
Right.
back to back to back.
I returned the thing intact. It already had a hole in it even before I borrowed it. And lastly, I didn't even borrow it, which Lacan even says it's like all valid statement, truth statements, but if we take them together, it creates a problem, right? It creates a contradiction.
Right. Right. So I had a hard time though relating that to the dream.
Well, he says it in like the last thing, in the second chapter about like the sort of logic of Freud's dream about like um sort of treating Irma. I mean, I don't want to like spoil. We can get into that later if you want, or I can explain it now. Pretty much like
Oh, we could get into it later.
okay,
But let's just keep that
yeah, that because I
joke in
mentioned
our
that's the
mind.
logic of the dream. But I did point out when he was talking to Irma in the dream, saying that here's a solution, but she was rejecting it. Well, if you reject it, it would only be your fault anyway if the pain continues, right? So that's one aspect of it, and like so,
Right, right,
yeah. I didn't treat you to begin with. She was already cured, pretty much.
right.
Well, and then that's another thing too, because what was Otto points out that like with the dirty syringe, it's like she'll contract dysentery and it will get rid of the poison anyway, so she'll be cured. Um, which is also an interesting thing.
He's kind of saying don't worry about your medical malpractice in a sense because
Right.
you'll be cured anyway.
Yeah.
Hmm. And then the other thing I wanted to point out, of course, there's this epic moment. Where is it? Where he describes the real, basically, but he doesn't use the expression capital R real here, but Slavoj often refers to this description. Sometimes I think he even quotes it directly here. Yeah,
Right.
the flesh one never sees, the foundation of things, the other side of the head of the face is secretory glands par excellence, specter of anxiety, identification of anxiety, the final revelation of you are this which is so far from you, this which is the ultimate formlessness. And this to me describes his theory of like ecstasy, something that
Exactly.
is so intimately you and so foreign at the same time.
Right. Yes. That's exactly what it is. Yeah. I was reading this going back into the check this for the crowd, for the audience. If you don't have
Oh,
this
nice.
book, please get this book.
I
Reading
gotta.
Systems 1 and 2. And there's a section that I was reading, and let me find it in the table of contents. But it goes over Lacan's notion of the real, and they actually mention the thing that Nick just talked about the ecstasy of it's more you than you. It's called the Overview of the Real with examples from Seminar 1 by Ellie Raglan. So, and he mentions that almost verbatim.
What
So that's
what
cool that
what
you brought
page
that.
is that on?
It's on. I just closed the book, but yeah, if you have this edition by SUNY Publishing Company,
Yeah, I had the
it,
same one.
yeah, it's on 192, an overview of the real from with examples from Seminar 1.
Oh, nice. I gotta
Yeah.
read this.
And it pretty much goes over like the whole thing about like how Das Ding is like the void, right? And that like how objet I guess orbits around the void, but we shouldn't say that objet the real is objet but objet has a real aspect to it of that lack void, which is interesting right here when he talks about the flesh in as much as it's suffering formless in and of itself, something that provokes anxiety, because it's like with that there's no object, and if there's no object, there's no identification. The only identification there is of anxiety.
Well, I think we have to be very careful here in the way we delineate the real and
Right.
okay, because it's like
Yeah.
there's the real of the absolute deadlock of the symbolic. But here, what is being investigated does show itself symbolically. It can be seen, and it's a very interesting manifestation of the real, in that, like, if we think of the real as, that which resists us symbolization, absolutely, of like what we can't get to because it exists beyond this horizon of understanding. We get back to like the Ding an sich, right? Like the thing in itself sort of conception of the real. But here it's like the real is showing itself as something that can be apprehended. You can see
Right.
it, but
And
it's
it's
like you
very
can't
uncanny.
gain any kind of purchase on it, in a sense, because it's like this, the flesh, it's there, right? This is one of the three reals that Slavoj describes in the preface to "For They
Or
Know
they
Not
know
What
what
They
to
Do," right?
do.
It's like the corporeal, the
Right.
corporeal,
Yeah. As
like
Adrian Johnson says, corporal real, like, a body as it is, right? He said he has like a play on words, corporal hyphen real.
is that Johnston?
Yeah, Adrian Johnston.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
That's sick. Yeah, because
Yeah.
it's like it shows another dimension to the real that is like in your face, literally like in your face, but in your face, like, and yet it can't be fully like fantasy. It's where fantasy fails to,
Right. And
to
because there's
symbolize it,
no there it fails because it can't be I guess it can't be symbolized, because the part of fantasy is that it also structures desire, it teaches desire, and there's like trying to really, I wouldn't say avoid, but it kind of like exposes the lack of symbolization, because right here with anxiety, right, there is this sort of specter that's coming on with this formless body, but it's so horrific and uncanny that like no words could come to sort of capture it.
right. Like, because right, that nomination is what he's going to talk about later. The naming of things gives the concept the time of its object,
Yeah.
but there's no time of the object in just like this undifferentiated physical truth. This is also a different kind of truth. Like, I think he's also getting at the truth of the thing that emerges on its own and does not give itself to the symbolic easily, and therefore erases the
Mhm.
dimension of the subject as they understand themselves in an imaginary form.
Right.
I wish I could find the where Slavoj describes the different forms of the real in for
And for the, yeah, I forget what page it is. In the Ford for the, it's a second edition, right?
yeah, we should be better prepared, I
But
guess.
like yeah, like there are sort of the tripartite within each register, and um I think, what is it, like this would be an example of like the imaginary real, right?
I think so, because there's the the real, the imaginary real,
And the symbolic real.
the symbolic real. But maybe, well, let's not.
And if I'm not mistaken, the symbolic real has to is what exposes sort of the deadlocks and contradictions, right?
Yeah, because but the real of the imaginary would also be like, I think, the real of quantum physics, like what he talks about in Sex and the Failed Absolute, where
Right.
you can observe it. It has to do with your subject position, but also more importantly, it doesn't. There's a kind of stupidity to the playing out of the real in this way. Um. Anyway, I can't find the exact passage, but wrapping this part up. Uh. Okay, we're good on time. 8 minutes to the hour.
Yeah.
Um. What? How do we want to wrap it up?
Um,
Anything about
I mean,
for just this chapter, Dr. M?
I think we could get into the part of like sort of the what page is this that you just got to? It's
157.
157. Okay, I'm already on here. Um, we can get into the whole thing about pretty much what this dream is and how it's sort of a meta dream. Because right here he mentions in this page that what is the meaning of neurosis? What is the meaning of the cure? How well founded is my therapy for neurosis? Pretty much all these questions sort of are answered within this dream of the dream, right? Uh, about the meaning of the dream is also the cure. Do you remember
Yeah.
that? Yeah. And it's pretty, I should say, a little like, I wouldn't say mind-boggling, but it's almost like a riddle.
Yeah, I don't quite understand it. Like, how would you relate neurosis to the dream? Okay, well, so neurosis is always based on like the repression of based on repression, the repression of a signifier of desire. That signifier of desire is in not as a positive, it's not posited in the dream so much as like carved out through its absence in the structure
Right.
of the dream. So I guess
Yeah.
that's the homology there.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. That's at least what I'm getting at, especially when we talk about um, the revelation of the trimethylamine word, right? Because it was revealed on the syringe, right? And he compares it to like sort of a biblical revelation of what is it? What are the three names, like Tekel, uh, uh,
Nene Tekel Upara Upar,
Uparsin, right, of the Bible.
which is
Uh,
the writing on the wall,
right.
like spells doom.
Exactly, yeah. And he then uses this as a sort of tripartite to kind of understand how, in all these sort of accounts that are going on within the dream, Freud trying to deal with countertransference, the guilt and anxiety of not knowing what he's doing, the sort of imaginary rivalry between his frenemy Otto and then uh, Dr. M or whatever. And then I forget the other dude's name. There's one other dude in there. Isn't like Leopold or something like that? Uh, like all these different things,
It
like
was always a Leopold back then.
yeah. But like these are all aspects in which like I guess like the ego or certain identifications mirroring are taking themselves into account, but the signifier right? Because it's always the subject trying to take itself into account, but it misrecognizes itself in these imaginary relations. Not to say that the guilt or anything like that is invalid, but mainly the signifier uh, that has a hard time revealing itself with because of like the whole acephalic thing, this headless thing. It gets sort of repressed. It takes the form of the word or of the formula of trimethylamine, right? Um,
which he says is the word as such. It is the
the,
word saying, "This is a word. I am a word."
exactly, right?
It's like in the beginning of the New Testament, right? In the beginning was the
Was the
word,
word
like
exactly?
logos. Yeah.
Yeah, and then it's like it shows that the subject is both the beginning and the end, right? Or the name, the trimethylamine, is the beginning and the end. And he kind of, Lacan summarizes this in this Greek word nemo, which translates to no one. Because it's like, well, who's the subject then? It's no one, right? It has no image. But I think right here, and this is where I'm kind of confused. It's like the subject, and because even though we're talking about the symbolic order, right? In this entire seminar, we haven't used terms like master signifier. We haven't used S1, S2. So in my speculation, if we retroactively bring the sort of later Lacan back into this one, are we preluding the sort of like S1 sort of revealing itself without a face?
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like hotly debated, but I like what Mikey has to say about it, which is like the S1, a master signifier is a name.
Right.
So if we bring it back to nomination, it's sort of like the word, the name, like what's the first name of
Right.
everything? It's like, because we
But
have S2s, like the individual named things, which I don't know if people would agree with that the chain of
yeah.
knowledge is that, but maybe, yeah, like, but then what names it all, right?
Right. And that's the word, right, that haunts us. And what trimethylamine has to deal with is the cure. It's the cure for Dora, and it's also the cure for Freud, and not only his dream, like what the meaning of the dream is, but also the cure for psychoanalysis.
Three registers.
Exactly.
That's fire.
Yeah. So we should probably end this half right here.
Quilt it at that point. I was gonna try to incorporate a Biggie reference. Like I used to read Word Up magazine, but I couldn't find a good point for it. All right, let's take a 10-minute break.
Yeah, sounds good.
I'll see you at 2:32.
Oh, nice. All right. Got it.
So I found a description of the triad that sort of reflects into itself here. This is from it's an anthology of
Mhm.
different authors talking about Lacan, but this is Zizek, and he says the entire triad reflects itself within each of its three elements. There are three modalities of the real, the horrifying thing, the primordial object. From the look into Irma's throat in the dream, which opens Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams, to the alien in Ridley Scott's film of the same name. The symbolic real, the real as consistency, the signifier reduced to a senseless formula like the quantum physics formulas, which can no longer be translated back into or related to the everyday experience of our life world. So I got that one wrong. That's the symbolic real. And then the imaginary real, the mysterious je ne sais quoi, the unfathomable something, on account of which the sublime dimension shines through an ordinary object.
So the imaginary real could kind of tie in with sort of the sublime object of like ideology in a sense.
Yeah, quite possibly. It's like
But what we're dealing with is the real, right?
the
For
real, right? There's
interesting.
nothing exactly sublime about the
No.
horrifying real. The imaginary real, though, on the other hand, makes, I guess, yes, certain sublime objects more real than others, just like money is
Right.
more real than most things.
Right.
It's the realest of all
Even
things.
if we
Yeah.
disavow it, it's like it takes like on like this power of its own, like almost like uh the fear of God type
Also,
image.
you'll like this though, the three modalities of the symbolic, the Jungian symbols and the symbolic.
Right.
I guess the imaginary symbolic is also Jungian symbols, New Age archetypes.
Yeah. Is this in the forwards before they know what they do, or is this that
No, but it's pretty much the same idea.
yeah.
The book is called Jacques Lacan, Critical Evaluations in Cultural Theory.
Oh yes, you sent me this link. This is the one that's got the perverse couple, right?
Yeah, it's really good. I'm gonna set the timer again. And I also want to say that I have a kind of a toothache right now, so I'm so dedicated to this material that I have something that needs to be possibly checked out in my mouth. I need Freud to take a look at the how did he describe it? Tubular or
Yeah. Tubular.
turbinate
Well,
remarkable molar, whatever. I got some kind of situation there, so this is
you probably want to go to your local dentist to ask him about the cogito then.
yeah. If anyone gets that joke, you are a true K-Voy head.
Probably were using the eye as another as mouthwash in that lecture.
Yeah, man. Nah, actually it was a rib, charred sinew of a rib that lodged itself back here. All right, let's conclude the dream of Irma's rejection. We need like some kind of major sound effect here because we actually have written out the imaginary, the real, and the symbolic. Bam. All together.
Dankness.
We might be able, I think we covered a lot of it already,
Right.
but there might be some niceties that have eluded us up until this point. So
There's something interesting, like I don't know if like you can probably make something out of here, but like when he mentions the sort of article that Levi Strauss posted or published, he's talking about how like when we observe different civilizations and the conditions that people live in, that seems rather harsh or whatever we want to compare it to, like our society, but it's like what you see is a sort of efficacy of the symbolic function as it's isolated as such. Um, and I guess what he's trying to get at is to see like how the symbolic function um, works vis-a-vis the subject, and how the subject in the symbolic order isolated within a patient kind of has the same like analogous effect of like looking at like the efficacy of like symbolic orders of different cultures.
Well, this is where we find ourselves in some muddy waters, because this is where Lacanian ideology can come about, in the sense of like exactly what Tupanamba is talking about.
Right.
What is the extension of Lacan and these concepts
The
in,
registers.
in the registers in the realm of culture as such, when we get to the more macroscopic level?
Right.
And one of the debates that is unfolding right now amongst different societies of Lacanians, and it was kind of spearheaded by Tupanamba's. What is psychoanalysis as a producer of truth? As I wish I could remember exactly how he put it, but pretty much, how can it set its own truth conditions and then also produce new truths that could be potentially transformative? Already it sounds a little bit like utopian what I'm saying, but when we get into some of these sort of parenthetical comments made by Lacan about culture or civilization being that of a civilization of hatred, we get into, I think, some sort of precarious, we put ourselves in a precarious position, because it's like, when he weighs in on these matters, what should we make of that? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
um, but obviously someone like Zizek and Zupancic and the Slovene school, they are mobilizing these concepts in ways that do attack, I don't mean attack violently, but like attack certain subjects that maybe those who are of a more like dogmatic clinical
Right.
persuasion would say, no, that's not what this is for. You're not supposed to be interpreting society as a whole through the lens of these concepts. And yet we know that people like Malher and Colette Soler, they do it all the time, right? And it's troublesome,
Right.
to say
Right.
the least. Anyway, that's a little aside. Let's go back to Irma's injection. I like this sort of interesting self memorialization kind of fantasy that Freud has here, where he imagines that in this house on July 24th, the secret of dreams was revealed to Dr. Sigmund Freud. And I think it's interesting that he mentions this twice, actually. He mentions this in the previous chapter.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, because it's like you're seeing history unfold. You're seeing something monumental shape itself here. But
Right.
but Freud's already aware of that. This is the kind of like metacognitive element
Yeah.
to it.
And it's like not only are we, like, because it's in relation to the dream, were we trying to create like a sort of biography of like uh Freud's historical achievements. What it is also kind of like the uh historicization of the subject in Freud, the scientist, Freud, the psychoanalyst, who's trying to mark on this adventure of achievement. But within the dream, we get like the subject of Freud as well.
Freud, Freud the analyst, Freud the great discoverer of dreams, the Lewis and Clark, the
Right.
unconscious, so to speak. This, maybe we could call it ego ideal
Yeah.
that he has of himself, and how it is constituted by this series of identifications. But then we also are treated to this passage from a letter he wrote to Fleiss, is it?
Fleece.
Fleiss,
Yeah.
where it's suddenly very Luciferian, where he's talking about everything gleaming and pulsating. And this is, as Lacan describes it, an anxiety-ridden dimension of
Right.
Freud's experience. Where was he where was he in his life? What were his affects? Although I guess anxiety, no,
Yeah.
anxiety is an affect in a
It
sense.
is. It's an affect, and the only affect that doesn't deceive or doesn't lie, which is the only affect that a Lacanian really cares about.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what Lacan's doing here is he's on the one hand dismissing the kind of culturalism of Erikson, but he's
Yeah.
also kind of aping this technique.
Right. Yeah. He's like,
Wait,
we shouldn't ignore it to like totally. We should make use of it only in the sense that Freud is a cultural figure, right? But it doesn't mean that we are going to use culturalism for every patient, right? Because as we talked about, it's like, oh, it's just because of your Islamic background and Catholic background, you're, cis white. No, what some of this usefulness of the culturalism has to deal with Freud is because Freud is trying to stand out within the culture as an enigmatic figure, as one who discovers the cure. And yet, simultaneously, it does help out in the sort of Freudian experience and in what Lacan is trying to do with his three registers, but also maintaining the Freudian uh, experience of getting at the truth, the particular truth of the subject. And it just so happens that as we historicize Freud, we're like historicizing his subject, we're also kind of outlining his cultural and scientific achievements and even his darkest times within those timelines as well.
really good point. It's like in reviewing, providing a kind of like resume of these details, though not so much to say, oh, this is why he was spurred towards the unconscious, but rather these details also do make up the structuration of Freud's desire as it reveals itself in the dream. I would say not so much in the sense of just like base wish fulfillment, but also
Right.
in the sense that what you were talking about before, in the dream, the subject is attempting to account for themselves in some
Same.
sense. And it's like Freud here is also trying to account for himself in his function, which he's not sure what the function of analysis
Right.
is at this point. It keeps
Yeah.
getting away from it. It keeps outpacing him in terms of how he sees himself.
Paul, Ernest, and myself, the three brothers.
Right, right. Ernest, Ernest goes to jail. Remember that movie? That's the Ernest he was talking about. That made no sense. All right, so
Neither does the unconscious sometimes.
no, no. Come on, I know we're not losing steam.
So
Really.
right here, I just had some pasta, so I gotta take a minute. Feeling the carbo load. Um,
Is
right here, like then we get into the whole problem of again what I talked about in the first section about regression, right? Because like right here, this is where we really understand why it's such a problem because for Erickson bros, like they care about this sort of culturalism that involve a sort of like oh, this adds in as sort of symptoms or defenses for the ego, and it almost seems like it's just like a sort of like Dollar General version of ego psychology, in which like pretty much, oh, this happened during your sort of historical development, so therefore we could say that it's the problem, and he's only focused on the ego, right? And so it's only the ego that regresses. Well, what we're talking about right here, if we're at the issue of the unconscious, we have to realize that Freud's ego, not Freud's ego himself, but like Freud's notion of the ego is a narcissistic relation, which always has to sort of mirror onto the other, right? And this develops a problem in the theory because, well, like I said, regression uh, can't always take itself, or not take itself into account. Regression can't always achieve its aim in the dream, right? When we realize that 3 registers and the sort of horrific experience of the real vis-a-vis Irma's body, formless as it is, um, you know, uh, not able to be named. Like this isn't regression right here. This isn't a pleasure principle. Um, and also, this shows that it decenters any sort of mastery on the account of the ego.
so what is the image of Irma's flesh have to do with
Well,
that, you think?
so Irma's flesh represents a point in which, like, again, so we talked about, because right here in this chapter, we're gonna get at to the importance of the symbolic and the narcissistic relation, and how the narcissism, right, it needs an object to mirror on, or like the other, um, and how if we're stuck in this imaginary relationship, then these things are fleeting, and that's why we need the symbolic order. But then, would not only do we have sort of stabilization of the object, we also have the sort of separation, as well as Lacan talks about in Seminar 11, right? Castration, but a double alienation, a double effect. But
I love that. Yeah.
yeah, but what I'm trying to get at is the fact that with Lacan and his critique of Erickson's approach is that he's no different than Anna Freud, and focusing on like all these things having to deal with like certain stages of libido development, because this is another thing that regression also is seen as, not just in the fact of, oh, you can't achieve the pleasure principle, so you could do it in your dream, you could achieve the wish fulfillment. Regression always has to do where it's like, oh, you didn't successfully complete the oral stage, anal stage, latency, etc., so you're always going to regress and repeat those certain moments. But this has to do with the ego for these thinkers.
Okay.
For Lacan, he is not on par with that, because he's a structural thinker, and this is what history registers have to show, is that the ego can never, the ego is always in an imaginary, frustrating
Right.
thing.
So this idea that when he was arguing with Falabrega over this notion that in the dream there is this regression, as he puts it here, at the associative levels, going from nem, which is
Yeah,
memory images, I guess we could call them,
right,
which
right.
are regressive. the kind of ego psych, Anna Freud, Eric Erikson approach would have to do with stages, right? Like
Yeah,
regressing stages,
developmental and cultural.
where I think Lacan wants us to get away from regression. He's using it as a kind of like entry point into the dream, but to show how the decomposition of the ego into its constituent symbolic identifications is what's at stake here, not like regressing in terms of stages necessarily.
Yeah. Well, he's trying to say that ultimately, like the regression for Freud and how it's appropriated in later schools just ultimately fails as a theory when we stick with the Freudian experience and see how when we look at like narcissism and the death drive, it's not a matter of regression, but a matter of like deadlocks, failures, and what Lacan would call the real. But with the narcissistic relation and with the death instinct, it's always a matter of repetition and failure because for narcissism, and when we go back to the play of writings for Lacan, narcissism represents the final object for sexual satisfaction in the three essays of sexuality. That every object is always a refining of an object, which means or which implies that the object was lost to begin with. So when we look at Fort Da, which represents this compulsion to repeat, it's always trying to gather in a new object. And not like an object relationist, but more of like an image of ourselves, of mastery. And it always leads to failure.
I've heard
Because
of it. I heard it described as like binary signifier. And
of
I don't want to conflate two ideas, but this idea of a later on with the formulas of sexuation, it's like the absence of a binary signifier, which would be that complementary sort of.
like compliments.
But maybe that's not relevant. I don't know.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm not versed in Seminar 20, so I mean, I don't know. But like for like sticking into like how those play writings tie in for Lacan in this stage of his thinking, we see that how like this pretty much like um is counterintuitive, or how like yeah, to like the formal understanding and even genetic development understanding of regression when we look at narcissism and death drive. Because again, like with this dream, narcissism takes place because it's always trying to identify itself with um, the other or other objects, uh, but it still needs the sort of account of the subject to do that. But there are aspects of the dream where the subject, can't account for itself, right? And I think that's where we get into this sort of anxiety in Freud. And just to kind of beat it a dead horse, that shows that regression fails as a theory, as a clinical understanding, but also like how the three registers really debunk this because of the real, right? That horrific thing, anxiety provoking thing in this dream that,
Here it is.
yeah.
Here's the relevant quote: anxiety provoking apparition of an image,
Exactly.
which summarizes what we can call the revelation of that which is least penetrable in the real, the essential object, which isn't an object any longer, but this something faced with which all words cease and all categories fail, the object of anxiety par excellence.
Right. Yeah, right here is interesting too, because he says like when the dream reaches its peak, what happens? Can we even speak of the process of regression in order to explain the fundamental destructuration which then occurs in the experience of the dreamer? And that's an interesting thing. It's like right here, and when we talk about like the symbolic order, not only it's like a matter of like signification or structuration, but what does he talk about it, and how does he like compare it into this seminar? He talks about it as a machine, right? And machines break down, but it seems like this symbolic order in the dream, or the subject trying to take itself into account within this like scaffolding of symbols, structures itself
I like
almost.
that.
But what's doing that? It seems like it's the death instinct.
I like how you put that, the scaffolding. It's like the subject trying to take itself into account is trying to clear a path for the emergence of an object which corresponds to it, but the structure itself is the subject.
Yeah.
So that the peak of the dream is that destructuration, where in a sense it reaches its object, but then it, in reaching its object, disintegrates because its own structure is the object,
Yeah.
I think. And that's what the dream's like trying to get at, I think. And then in the way that it sort of like teases apart all the identifications that make up the ego, it's looking for that one thing, right? But what it's looking for is the very process itself. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I mean, I wonder if we could tie in like in this taking itself into account, like with set theory, like what was is it Frege or is it Russell? Uh it might be Russell's paradox about the barber that only shaves people in the town that don't shave themselves.
I know the one, I mean, it's another version of Russell's paradox, but like, I don't know, the catalog of, you have a catalog of like that sells furniture, and then in the back of the catalog is a list of all the other catalogs
Right.
that also sell furniture. Does it include itself in that catalog, or then that's a negation of
Oh, yeah, yeah.
like turning itself into another thing? So there's a deadlock there. I'm
Yeah.
not doing it good. I'm not explaining it well, but
I think yeah, that kind of makes sense. But it's like the barber as well. It's like, well, does he who shaves the barber, right?
I don't
Because
know
because
what the
because
whole,
it's like the barber shaves everybody in town that does not shave themselves. So it's like he can't shave themselves, or he can't shave himself is the whole thing. So who shaves the barber?
right. And it's interesting though, because what's at stake there is identity, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
Does he, if he shaves himself, does he cease to be a barber because he's shaving the barber? You know what I mean? So it's like he can literally shave himself, obviously.
Right. Obviously, it's not the point. It has to
So
deal
he,
with like set and relations and identity, because it's like then if somebody in town shaves something, it's like, well, then he's no longer the barber.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. That, yeah, and that's what's really fascinating here, and it reminds me of Mikey. Really did a great job of unpacking this in his latest article, which is how the death drive seeks ultimate jouissance, ultimate excitation, but also the cessation of that excitation simultaneously.
Right.
So it can only make itself its own object, which is to reach the absolute peak of jouissance, but also to overcome, to sublate
Yeah.
jouissance, to make it no more. And
Yeah,
that's
because
what I
that's what would make it
reminded of here.
absolute, right? Is to experience this like fullness of jouissance that you no longer need to repeat it, right?
Right. You would no longer, like, repetition seeks the end of repetition, which leads to the subject.
Yeah.
That's what structures the subject. That's why the subject is death driven in that sense.
Yes.
That's fire.
That's a banger right there.
There's a joke here that can't be translated, unfortunately, I think.
Yeah. Of like,
Or maybe it's a
yeah.
little bit later on about like Latin or something. There are a lot of jokes here. What's unfortunate is that, I mean, because French is so like is such a great candidate for endless punning and everything, that I think Lacan illustrates a lot of his ideas through these plays on words, that can't come across in English, but I know like McGowan's not a fan of that kind of thing. Way.
Oh yeah.
I think it's kind of fun though.
Right here is pretty interesting in this page too of 65, where he, again, what I was mentioning about like Anna Freud and Erik Erikson, he talks about how when we look at we have to recognize with the state of affairs and like the development of the ego for them, it's just like the question is, with defense mechanisms and the development of the psychic development of the ego, one has a question of whether the symptom is attached to it within its development. Like where is the function of the symptom within, I guess, a sort of developmental stage that sort of brings into fruition a so-called ego, for them.
Right. Remember what he says in Seminar 1, the ego is the symptom par excellence.
Yeah. And it's the par excellence because it's like the human condition.
Yeah.
Because it's split, it's the wound. I found about this term recently, which is called like the narcissistic wound of having of being an ego in general, of like, or not being an ego, but like being alienated because of the development of narcissism, right? It's not like, okay, then you get an ego, and then it's like you're going through the stages of progression, and then you'll be finally what the ideal image of a human's supposed to be. And then in those the stage developments, if somehow something didn't go right in the process, then regression happens, and then we'll just like kind of sort of see what happens to strengthen those defenses to make you more resilient. It's like that's not what we're talking about at all. It's the fact that the ego even exists is a question, and sort of not only the symptom but the wound itself, right?
I love that. Yeah, it's a kind of symptom. It's an ailment.
Yeah.
Yes. But it's interesting though, because it's like the ego as a symptom is in line with the pleasure principle, wouldn't you say? Because it's like what stabilizes us. Was this a point you were making recently?
I think when it comes to the pleasure principle, it's like we can't attain that. But I think for Freud, it's like Todd McGowan points this out in the Why Theory episode on Beyond the Pleasure Principle, but of like how he thinks Freud was a dualist, and how it's really Lacan that tries to point out the contradictions and antinomies and make him more of a dialectical thinker, but that the life drive, and he would just call it life drive and libido drive, or just like death drive later on. But he would see these as mutually exclusive. That I think the ego would be on the level of life drive and the pleasure principle, and that the libido itself and that excess ultimately amounts to what would be the death drive.
Right, because he has this idea of the pleasure ego too.
Right. And it's like, and one thing is, it's like what makes Lacan a great reader of Freud is that he's trying to create a sort of systematic reading and structural approach to his ideas, because like we all know that Freud was not a totalized thinker. He didn't have when he came out, he's like, I have the doctrine, this is like my set magnum opus. It's like each text he's always invoking a different problem and trying to get into like a sort of detective investigation with what is at stake with instincts and their vicissitudes, with narcissism, with the dream, or with the unconscious. And it's up to like the reader and Lacan to pretty much tie and play these writings together, because each thing, like, he pretty much is approaching it differently, and kind of will start to like feel like he won't talk about it in different essays. Like, for instance, like Todd pointed out that it's really beyond the pleasure principle where you only see death drive. I think he does mention it in Civilization and Discontent, but other than that, you don't really see death drive being talked about after 1920.
Right. And a lot of analysts dismiss the idea as eccentric.
Yeah.
But Lacan was very bold in taking it up again.
Right.
As something that's not only an important feature of Freud's system, but like the central idea And that's a pretty bold stance to have back then.
Right.
Maybe one of the things that could have contributed to his excommunication, who knows?
Well, mainly it
We
was
know what.
mainly it was that, and because he was lying about doing it. Danny Novus in his new
Oh,
biography,
he's lying.
yeah, because he lied to a letter of Ballant about like doing variable length sessions, and it was like obviously the IPA that found out, but the thing is that all his colleagues, voted against like keeping him within the IPA because they were told like, oh, you could just stop doing it and we could still keep you. And it's like everybody voted against him.
I didn't like him.
Yeah.
But I like what you were saying before, because it's like he's doing for Freud what Freud couldn't do for himself.
Yeah.
Essentially, he was too in the he couldn't see the forest for the trees of his own theories, because it's like that all of this is unraveling in real time as he's exploring these cases. So
Yeah.
only someone like Lacan
And nobody
could
really,
do this for him.
right. And then none of his students really like took on the project to carry on. They all went their separate ways. Like Ferenczi went a separate way. Jung went his separate way during the narcissism era. Like, it's like he had NWA and then like literally freaking it all broke up and like Freud was like easy still.
Yeah,
Young was Ice Cube.
Freud in the Hood. Young was Ice Cube. DJ Yella is Valabrega. I don't know.
Ferenczi would be Dre.
That's funny. I like this phrase here. What did I try to get across with the mirror stage? He's always trying to.
Right.
I think he feels like his mirror stage concept is too not naive, but overly simplified.
Yeah.
And he's
But
always
there's a
like
lot of
trying to clarify, like this is what I mean.
right.
This is an elaboration on the concept of the mirror stage that really gets to the heart of it. But this ideal unity, the what you were saying before about like mirrors and everything. He also says how there are a lot of things in this world that act as mirrors.
Right. Right.
And it's like that's I think essential for understanding the nature of the symbolic, is that the symbolic, it does and doesn't introduce new content into what we call reality. It does in the sense that through nomination something becomes what it is, but there's no positive sort of substance that comes with the symbolic either necessarily.
And that's yeah.
The symbolic serves the purpose of being let's call it like a two-way mirror between two individual subjects, and what that does is prevent the I and the you from becoming endlessly absorbed into one another, even though that's going on anyway.
Right.
It creates a kind of illusion that there's a separation.
Yeah. And I
That
think
separation is experienced as a wound, though.
right.
That's
And I think
but it's
that's
like a necessary
interesting.
wound.
Like when you look at like the symbolic order, yeah, like it doesn't bring anything new, but with the sort of dynamic relationship with the imaginary, and like this is kind of like what Zizek talks about, and like where they know what they do with sort of failure and how you start at the same spot, which I think is symbolically the same spot, but the perspective and the learning that you get from error takes place in a sort of imaginary sense, right? Because imaginary relationships has to do with understanding, right? Because this is the whole point of Merleau-Ponty. What he got wrong was he was too stuck in the imaginary and trying to get at understanding, and he couldn't see how the symbolic function operates, which sort of undermines phenomenology a little bit.
Can't you sort of relate it to, I don't know, starting a new job or something? where you're introduced into a new symbolic order and nothing makes sense. And over time, everyone might reassure you that it will make sense eventually. They're so certain that it'll make sense that you'll adapt.
Yeah.
That like the meaning behind the design of the role it's like itself, what is undergirding
Right.
will emerge, but it's like it's made to emerge in an imaginary way. And that learning is, it's like the whole, your favorite joke about the funeral and the wedding, many happy returns. It's not that, oh well, now this makes sense because it's logical.
Right.
It makes sense that you would say many happy returns as a positive thing in this circumstance, whereas you would say may God rest his soul in this circumstance. No, it's not that it's logical, it's that the logic of it is forced to adapt to the what's arbitrary, to the structure.
Right. And no, like that does make sense when you talk about the getting a new job, right? Because like, the everybody in like the company or whatever, all the employees will reassure you that like things will start to make sense, you'll adapt, but it's never like in this positive way, like because like, you'll get like people that are like, oh yeah, you'll get used to everything. You're gonna hate this place, right? You're gonna hate this job. Like the manager, total dickhead, So
Right.
you'll get to use these, and then it's like you don't understand, but like you keep hearing the words, the sort of signifiers come out, but they don't start to quilt until finally you start to mirror with those words when you have the experience with that dickhead manager, and you're like, oh yeah, you're right. I'm like, damn, this place does suck. It's like only then can you actively start to make sense of your symbolic position that you related to back to the beginning when you were told, hey, this you're going to get used to this place. You're going to hate it. It sucks, and the manager's a dick.
Right, because like you learned how to mirror in a way that helps you blend in, and that's learning.
Mm-hmm.
Essentially, that's where some of these unwritten and written rules
Right.
come into it. That's the symbolic order right there. It's not when
Right.
it makes sense because they are inherently rational.
Uh-huh. And you see like learning from error take place because maybe you do something like maybe it's like wrong or just like wrong towards the manager, and that's why like you learn, oh shit, yeah, this person's a dick. I hate this place.
Yeah. But I like also, we talked about a lot of this already, but what he talks about here with this sort of, let's say, fragmentation, this series of images where man perceives himself in these component parts.
Yes.
Together they make up a total relation.
Right. Yeah.
But what he's trying to represent to himself in the dream is the very way, maybe I'm using this phrase incorrectly, but I'll go for it, the way in reality one cognitively maps the world. Again, the self-registration of the subject in this sense is in the dream is like the actual trying to represent the procedure
Yeah.
as such.
Yeah, and with the certain like series of identifications with that, the imago, as he talks about in the mirror stage lecture or essay, but then right here, since we're talking about like how this relates to these two seminars, not only does he talk about mirrors, but he, like you said, like things in the world act as mirrors in themselves, right? Where like they're reflective, you can sort of like identify with them, but then also the recording machine, which maintains the sort of consistency for that. And I think that ties into what he says right here about the narcissistic outcome of this libidinal relationship with the subject, which is called Verliebtheit, like what I said before, self-simping.
That's so good. You gotta trademark that. Self-simping.
But like it's because of that like libidinal investment into that image that like maintains that sort of consistency to allow you to continue to map on and sort of gain this ground within the world and develop, or maybe not develop's not the right term, but you also get this split of not only your image but also how you see it within time. So then you get ego ideal, right? And how you see it in others. How others want you want others to see you, that recognition. The gaze of the big other, right? That develops your ego
Right.
ideal. Yeah.
You can think of it like if you spend a lot of time working on a particular project, you might get some praise from people. So, hard work does show, but it's like you might want the regard of someone in particular, someone you look up to, and then like that person withholding
Yeah,
the
exactly,
regard
exactly.
is going to hurt you and make maybe your project feel vain, in the sense that, well, I need the mediating gaze of this specific
Right,
person
right,
or this
right.
institution or this group of people in order for what I'm doing to have any validity.
Hmm.
That's like the ego ideal. It's always mediated.
Exactly, yeah. So, and that's something different from like the sort of ego of Erikson bros and Anna Freud. You know, I mean, I could be wrong. Maybe they do talk about it, but like for them, it's like they're only focused on the ego that they forget about the Freudian unconscious.
Right, because we always have to remind ourselves that the ego is, well, parts of it are unconscious.
Right. And but at the same time, there's always anticipation in it, which requires it to always be outside of itself.
What do we mean when we talk about anticipation?
Well, what Lacan gets at in this one is the importance of the naming the thing, right? And how the symbolic order um, helps give stability and consistency for identification, because there is this weird relationship that the imaginary has with itself, that these perceptions and images for identification are very fleeting and it can be very traumatic. And I guess without the symbolic order, I mean, it almost sounds like psychosis. Um, that this is why there is a sort of importance for language, even though it does, in making us speaking beings, split subjects, um, going through this double alienation of not only the image, but also identifying with language. But it also acts like a necessary repression from the amount of raw intensities that come from this experience of the image fleeing and even encountering the traumatic real, right? Of this formless, extimate body or whatever, uh, that it in this identification, that it's a lure, it's an investment, and it's also enigmatic. That's why he compares it to the animal kingdom, right, with mating. But for us, it's like we hold on to that image, and when we realize that it's moving, it's fleeting, and it gets rid of the sort of stability, because the image has to do with the image of the body. And so for language, what it does is it sort of keeps the sort of eternal form of it. We could speak about it, but we have to anticipate not only ourselves as the body, but also as what it means to be man. And that's why he talks about in logical time. It's not time of like, phenomenological time or like quantum physics time. It's logical in the sense that you're trying to anticipate your relation to others and deduce that you are part of this world by how other people act, how other people mirror
Right.
onto how you mirror onto other people, other subjects.
Like
That
like if you go into a coffee shop or something, you're looking to see where the register is, where the line starts,
right,
what the menu is, how much things cost. It's like there's anticipation in that. you're constantly adapting to
Yeah.
the dynamic that presents itself in that moment. Is like, but in that there's also like an investment in the truth and the subject supposed to know, that is like the institution at any given moment, which
But
is
you
the
can,
feel itself.
yeah, you can also do this like, and so I got two examples. One is like a more just like average everyday example. It's like when you are like with your significant other and you like watching like, I don't know, maybe like a comedy movie or like Star Wars for the first time with them. Like not your first time, it's their first time, and you've been hyping it up. So as you're watching the movie with them, you're looking back at their reactions of how they gaze at the screen. So it
Right.
anticipates that they're enjoying, and it helps you realize their enjoyment so that you can enjoy as well and be in this sort of symbolic relation of what it means to enjoy movies as, you know, man or as a human being. Another way is going to be a clinical sense in which anticipating the analyst's reactions to what you say, so that you could see it's like, am I a bad person or am I a good subject? Am I going to get this sort of uh, kernel of truth that's going to cure me and make me a symbolic subject, you know, and make me normal again?
Right, which is that's what's at the end of the rainbow always, and
Yeah.
all of our interactions in a sense,
Yeah.
which
Because
is,
that's the whole
yeah,
point of being the analyst, is like the analyst is like we or not the point of being like the question of and concern of what an analyst position is always like very, I guess, dubious, but like this is the Lacan's point. It's like, what is the purpose of analysis and what is the analyst's situation within the symbolic order, uh you know, for the patient, because they're not going to, you know, fulfill your desires. They're not trying to mirror onto you, but at the same time, and this also goes in with payment, right? The payment acts as transference, but then when we get into the actual clinical work, the analyst stays there reserved, just listening as the patient is free associating. And so it's always like, well, a question of not only technique, but like for the analyst, and like, what is the analyst like fantasizing
right.
about? Well,
And
you know,
the analyst will also show up in your dreams.
yeah, that too. Yeah. And that also acts into like not only transference, but also like there's a certain like anticipation of how you imagine the analyst to be, to, I guess we could use cognitive mapping. That seems like a really good term to use. How you're supposed to
Sounds
be
good.
in analysis. Yeah, you know.
Oh, and that, okay, so this brings us to the kettle with the hole in it.
Right, right, right.
The victim was already dead, already ill with an organic ailment, which was precisely what Freud could not cure. Freud, the murderer, was innocent of any intention to harm. The crime in question was curative for the illness, which was
It's
dysentery.
just dysentery.
Words. But so it's not so much like, it's not just that the dream can accommodate mutually exclusive truth statements, but also that there's this triadic form that reveals itself once again.
Right, right. And that's what I got out of it too.
But it's curious. I feel like there's something I'm missing here with like,
What I think is like very interesting about this logic is the fact it's like that the person was already cured anyway, and so it's like that right there is like the displacement of guilt.
displacement of guilt, because it's like, I didn't do the curing as the doctor. The cure
Right.
didn't come from my syringe. My syringe is dirty.
Yeah.
That's why it's interesting. It's the dream of Irma's, not rejection, injection. Um, like that's the injection.
Mhm.
That's the focal point.
Yeah.
Syringe, the injection. administering the cure, and that being a problematic to be dealt with.
Yeah.
What does it mean to administer a cure? What does my technique amount to?
Right. No, yeah, that's definitely, I think, what we're getting at, especially with the whole, and why, like with the syringe, like the name of the trimethylamine formula also appeared as well. You know, acts as like the signifier, or the word, as he says.
And then he brings up cybernetics real quick. That's what we're going to get into.
Right, in these later ones.
Wait, so you read this entire seminar though, right?
No, actually, this is like reading this section is my first time. So
Oh shit. So
yeah,
we reached the point where
yeah,
where Virgil is
our guide. But
well, you're my Virgil right now, but you're also now like in the Divine Comedy, there are things Virgil doesn't, not saying you won't understand them, of course, but like things that he's not always so sure of, that he
yeah,
progresses up Mount Purgatory because he gets closer and closer to like God's revelation, and it makes less
right.
sense to a pagan, which is what you are, to my mind, a pagan. No, this is cool though, because we're getting into some crazy territory here with cybernetics, and I feel like the second half of this seminar is going to be pretty wild.
Yeah, and right here he talks again about the acephal, right? The headless subject, right?
Acephalic, yeah.
Right.
See, it is acephalic.
Yeah.
Acephalic character of the subject, and the voice of no one that causes the trimethylamine formula to emerge. The last word on the matter, the word for everything. This word means nothing except that it is a word.
Mm.
This is very metal.
Yeah.
I feel like it's Luciferian mystery. Like, yeah, this is
This
the
is a
most
metal core.
this
This
is
is a
like the
metal
most
core.
metal Lacan's been so far.
And very occulty like, you know.
Or an alternative title for this chapter could be Finding Nemo.
Oh, I love that.
You can take that.
Yeah. I was thinking of something too with the acephalic, because you were talking about phallus. The acephallus, you know, the shaft without a head.
Or maybe something like with circumcision,
Yeah, that's exactly
right? Like,
the castration,
exactly.
right? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, never an end to the jokes that could be made here, but this part, see, this is where you want to be able to speak French, because it's like, as they say in the footnote, this part's like really dramatic. I like it, but I want to be forgiven for having dared to begin these cures. Like,
Yeah.
sounds like some kind of confession, but there's this whole series of word games he's doing here with I and me. So I think
Yeah.
it's illustrated to me as not just like, oh, well, like you could see this as the latent content of the dream, but also with going back and forth between I and me, you get the structure, the form of the dream too.
Mm-hmm.
In language, you get full speech in that, like, it's structured by this interplay of I and me.
Right.
So that's pretty sick.
Yeah. I wonder if that like whole point of how he's speaking of like I am guilty and I want to be cured of not being guilty and all this stuff is like very like synonymous with like um subjective destitution with like Zizek, and like how he compares like with Jesus dying on the cross and he says, Father, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah, I mean, he does, like, there's definitely a Christ-like resonance here in
Yeah.
the way he's describing Freud, but absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. It's like, Freud is going through something like subjective destitution, because what is subjective destitution but emptying oneself out of the identifications, the
Right,
supposed
right, right.
identifications that are taken as like the truths of oneself.
Exactly.
But the note he ends it on, and we have 2 minutes. I mean, we can end it before that, but the note he ends it on here is, of course, like the function of the death instinct.
Right.
So we're halfway through seminar 2. It took a
Yeah.
little longer than 1, but let's plant our flag here. It's been a wild ride. This Lacan, he's a wacky fella.
Yeah.
He defeated Valabrega, made short work of him. Hippolyte, he's fallen off the map. All our favorites are like, I'm feeling a little lonely here. Like
Yeah.
Manoni's gone. Hippolyte disappeared. Valabrega was.
Well, Manoni comes back later on, though.
Oh,
In
thank
these,
God.
yeah, yeah, he's in a couple of them. I
Manoni.
don't know if like Hippolyte ever stays in any of the rest of the seminars, but he's always talking to like new peeps. It seems like.
Does Leclerc show up again? I like
I'm
Leclerc.
not sure, to be honest.
Yeah, Leclerc. I think Lacan he mistreats him. Leclerc is all right, but he
Yeah, yeah.
kind
No,
of
no.
a
Leclerc is like a really
whipping
good.
boy.
Yeah, but like right here though, like to cap it off, like of uh what is right here, he talks about the schema of the schematization of the function of the death instinct. He says we are beginning to see why it is necessary that beyond the pleasure principle, which Freud introduced as being what governs the measure of the ego and installs consciousness in relation with a world in which it finds itself, that beyond exists the death instinct. Beyond homeostasis of the ego, there exists a dimension, another current, another necessity, whose plane must be differentiated, a compulsion to return to something which has been excluded by the subject, never entered into it. And he mentions the repression, Verdrown. It's like, again, that's what we're getting at in relation to the death instinct, is that this return of something that was repressed, right? And he asks, it's like, to cap it off, why did Freud ever call it the death instinct to begin with?
Right. I love that he also says the repressed can't be brought back into the pleasure principle, into
Exactly.
the frame of the pleasure principle.
Right. Because from my understanding, right, like what is repressed, it's not that like it's something that just like because Freud has like primary repression and secondary repression, but like the secondary repression comes with all the defense mechanisms and culture and stuff like that. But then there is the primary repression that it's just like there's so much of like libidinal excess that comes before the development of like speech and language and all that stuff. So I wonder if we're getting at this sort of excess that failed to be symbolized, but also it fails to be sublimated as well. So that's why it can't be in the pleasure principle.
Fails to be sublimated. And it, Zizek here says that it's actually that excess that is strangely like prior to everything else, though.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why Freud calls it primary repression, because it's prior to everything else, right?
Like the excess that we get, as if you think about like the miscellaneous category, Slavoj's whole example of like the different trash cans and then
Right.
just waste. You would think, okay, well, that's after the fact. Everything that doesn't go into these other receptacles goes in here. But the paradox of Hegel and Lacan in this regard is that actually that waste, that miscellaneous category, comes first.
Yeah.
We get the separation.
Yeah. Zizek in the trash cans. My God, you call this porn?
Oh, this is pornography. Oh my God.
It's the best.
It's so hilarious. They just have to like scratch scrounging around in a
Yeah.
like
But like these gestures that people just find funny and hilarious, it's like they don't get the whole structure of what he's getting at. It's like these are perfect like capitalist or like ideology critique of understanding psychoanalysis and how the excess and repression or from our jouissance has a materiality that takes on a life of its own in the symbolic order of capitalism. And
right.
it's like when we come to recognize it, we disavow it. And in a sense, it's like because he's bringing it in a form that is approachable, it could be one realized, and paradoxically, it can also be disavowed because we
Well,
come too close to our fantasy. And
yeah,
it's like it's this.
but that's a question that's always on my mind, which is like we think from a Reichian point of view that society is built on repression. And Lacan himself says, well, the family is a product of repression in television. But then it seems like though capitalism has more to do with disavowal, though,
Well,
which is
so
like,
yeah,
that's something that can be that with all you need to do is just like take a step back in a corny kind of way and like see, just look at what you're looking at and see it as like unfamiliar, and then you see what's disavowed. um but like it doesn't seem as strong as repression. Why is it
right.
a society of disavowal rather than a society of repression?
Well, the thing is that if we take capital and its logic as perversion, that there is a sort of inversion of neurosis with perversion, and perversion does have repression to it. But the thing is that what disavow does is it exacerbates that. Even though I know, I still believe, right, that the idealization that I have and the certainty of jouissance that I get from it is more powerful, and I
Right.
enjoy more
Right.
than with the negative reality. That's the thing about perversion is that they know exactly what they're doing, but they believe something different.
Right, because it can be mobilized. That's why it's perverse.
Exactly. In
It
a
can
sort of
be
cruel
mobilized in a way. You
way.
can't mobilize repression, because repression only through analysis, or maybe not only through analysis, I mean it returns on its own, but you can, part of the fun and the game of being in a subject of capitalism is to like what you choose to disavow, when you choose to disavow it. You're not always disavowing it. There are moments when, like, based on unwritten rules, you're called upon to like to avow something that you would otherwise disavow. So that makes more sense. If it's just a society of repression, then it would mean that, like, oh, if we got more in touch with our sexual instincts and they were allowed an outlet that was
Right.
socially acceptable in a way that accounted for every shade and hue of sexuality, then society would be less violent,
But
less cruel.
the problem of like of right, and even Marcuse takes this up, and then like D&G is that they confuse repression with suppression and domination.
Right.
Whereas like repression is something that acts primordially within the subject, on its own as a defense mechanism, but also because it just can't symbolize all this excess, right? Because we have to think about the subject as polymorphously perverse. And through language, right, there's the mapping of like the limits of jouissance, but that excess that doesn't get accounted for, right? That is what's repressed. It's the secondary aspect of repression is tied in with the family structure, with society, with norms. And in some cases, it could tie in with suppression and domination, depending on the type of society. But there is a primary repression for Freud. I'm not sure if
Right.
Lacan takes this on, but like I would imagine this makes sense, especially when we talk about the polymorphous perversity aspect of it.
There's a difference between, suppression or social repression, and then Verdrängung, as like,
Yes,
that's
the
why
imprint.
Hansich prefers Verdrängung to describe the kind of primary repression, which is like you said, social structures or edibilizing structures, if we want to give Dilla some credit here, whatever, like, yeah, society can be like operate in that way, but society can't be the agent of primary repression necessarily. It can't be
Exactly.
like a
And
bunch of guys like in a bunch of like old white crusty men like in a boardroom somewhere being like, all right, here's how we're going to repress everybody. It's like, it
exactly.
doesn't work that
And
way.
the thing is that they also think that repression is not just like social repression, but that the key to fighting off repression or domination is that if everybody was having sex more, expressing themselves in these practices, like in a Foucauldian, Reichian, bust a nut type shit, like things would be better. But it's the fact is that we are doing that today, and the amount of that like commodities and marketing that sex has, is through the roof compared to like the traditional Victorian society and feudalism. The point is that sex is a failure not of the act, but in the amount of enjoyment, right? The deadlocks
Right.
of enjoyment. It has nothing to do with practices and kinks and fetishes.
Right, because that's like you were talking about the other night with Freud's Freud's homie who was like, well, without that, life wouldn't have much
Right.
meaning, right? Because it becomes it stands as like the end all be all of existence. Like it's the enjoyment, like metonymically
Right.
displaced. It's like that is the enjoyment of all enjoyments. Um,
And that's why it's not about the act, it's about the fantasy that comes with it.
right. Um, cool. Should we end it there?
And there. This should actually be like a other skit. Like we should do like a bonus clip, like this whole thing on repression and disavowal.